Okay, I think we can start. Excellencies, colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen, um, good afternoon. Welcome to the Lee Kuan Yew School. My name is Francesco Mancini. I'm a Vice Dean for Executive Education and an Associate Professor in Practice here at the school. And it gives me a great pleasure to host Professor Kingsley Moghalu, who is the inaugural president of the newly funded African School of Governance, based in Rwanda, but with a Pan-African ambition. And I hope Professor Moghalu will say a little bit about the school as well. I also want to take the opportunity to share that we just signed an MOU between our two schools, and we look forward to continue to partner with this new endeavor on multiple fronts, from the executive education to the master programs, research, and outreach. Um, I want to thank all of you for joining this talk in this very rainy day, an unusually long rainy day. So thank you very much. On a public lecture on Africa development in the context of shifting global political dynamics. I'll give a short introduction, then I will introduce Professor Mogale and then let him to take the floor. Now, we all, I think, been watching the events of the past few months unfolding under our eyes with maybe a degree of surprise or of witnessing profound geopolitical changes. So far, most of this unraveling has focused on the American continent as well as on the transatlantic relations, leaving Africa and Asia relatively untouched. But in any case, these changes are far reaching, and especially for regions like Africa, whose economic and political fortunes are closely linked to external global forces. One such force is obviously the US foreign policy, which has historically played a role in shaping Africa's trade, investment, and governance. And the current US administration's departure from, let's call it, traditional US Africa relations is introducing policies that will alter Africa's economic landscape in a way that I think is still evolving as we speak. Now, Professor Moghalu will critically examine how Africa's economic, political, and social progress are affected by this new global context. But beyond that, we'll also look at a comparative development trajectory of Asia and asking what lesson Africa can learn to better navigate the complexities of a rapidly evolving global order. Africa has made remarkable economic progress over the past 2 decades. In the past 20 years, the continent GDP grew at an average annual rate of 4.6%, making it one of the fast-growing regions in the world, just second to the Asia-Pacific region, which, for comparison, grew of approximately 5.8%. Contrary to what makes the news around the world, many African economies saw a rapid expansion fueled by increased trade, foreign investment, and growing middle class. Extreme poverty declined from 58% in 2000 to 43% in 2020. And sectors like technology, finance, and manufacturing has emerged as new engines of growth. Yet, Africa development is deeply intertwined with global political dynamics. And here I just want to mention 3 key questions. I know that some will be addressed by Professor Moghalu, but in case we can pick it up at the end in our Q&A. So first, what are the implications of this American First doctrine, which leads to reduction in foreign aid, more tariffs, and shift in the US-Africa trade agreements? Second, what are the implications for Africa of the weakening of multilateralism? Africa has been and is a champion of both regionalism and multilateralism, particularly when it comes to security and trade. And finally, how will Africa economic ties with China develop going forward? As we put China in this sentence, we can also think beyond China and thinking about how Africa's economic ties with India or with Southeast Asia will develop going forward. I think these are quite complex and critical issues, not only obviously for Africa. And as we talk a lot about Africa, I just want to close my remark reminding to everybody that Africa is not a country. And so, of course, um, these dynamics will inevitably play differently in different countries of the continent. But for sure, we can say that geopolitics, economics, and international relations will deeply be affected in the decades ahead. Now, without further ado, allow me to briefly introduce to you Professor Kingsley Mogalo. As I said, is the inaugural president of the African School of Governance. Previously, he was professor of practice in international business and public policy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, Oxford Martin Visiting Fellow at the University of Oxford, and earlier served as a deputy governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. Prior, he had a 17-year career in the United Nations system. We were just sharing some stories, starting in the Department of Peacekeeping. Just a year or two after peacekeeping was created in 1992, spent some time in the region in Cambodia, and then moved to Croatia, but also has posting in Tanzania, in New York, and in Switzerland. He later founded the Sogato Strategies, which is a risk and strategy advisory firm in Geneva and Washington, as well as the Institute of Governance and Economic Transformation, which was a public policy think tank. Professor Mungaro has also served as a special envoy of UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, on post-COVID-19 development finance for Africa. He obtained a PhD in international relations at London School of Economics, a master at the Fletcher School of Tufts University, and an LLB degree from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. In all this impressive career, he also found the time to run as a candidate of the office of the President of Nigeria in the country general election in 2019. Professor Kinley, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for choosing our school here in Singapore for giving your talk. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesco. Excellencies, Dean Kuan, my colleagues, Francis Gattari, Special Advisor to the President of Rwanda, Ambassador of Rwanda, my colleague Ngozi Njamanze, and other distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's a very great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you this evening about Africa's development trajectory in the context of the Trump Presidency 2.0. And I'm going to, bring some perspectives to bear on this very topical issue. So first of all, let me introduce the subject and introduce Africa in the context of its history, and in the context of its present, and in the context of its future. Now, since its origin as the cradle of mankind, Africa's history has gone through several epochs. Those epochs include the very early ones, like the ancient Egyptian civilization of mainly African origin that built the Great Pyramids, that invented writing in 3250 BC as the second civilization to do so. The first was Mesopotamia, which today is the Iraq region. But Africa invented writing after Mesopotamia, but before China. And also invented mathematics 4,000 years ago. So this is the kind of history, early history that Africa had. Another phase was what we describe as the great kingdoms, between 1300 and 1500 and 1600 AD. These were the pre-transatlantic slave trade great kingdoms of ancient Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Up to this point, Africa's history was one of relative greatness, innovation, and self-reliance. But from this transatlantic slave trade going onwards, a different reality began to set in the continent. And Africa came largely under foreign domination, especially by the European colonial powers. later on, so we had first the transatlantic slave trade, then we had colonialism when slave trade could no longer be sustained. And so the colonizers came to Africa as they came to Asia as well. And I'll speak to this a little bit later. Um, and later on, African countries were able to achieve independence politically from these colonial powers. After they achieved independence, they nevertheless became client states under the Cold War, client states to America or client states to the Soviet Union, most of them. And so this whole question of domination continued. An era of military rule followed in the continent in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, or the 60s, 70s, and 80s, more accurately, up until the end of the Cold War. And that epoch was followed by the rise of the United States in a unipolar world, but it didn't last long before China erupted as a massive contemporary global power in the early 2000s. And when China came, Africa still remained a pawn in the competition between China and the West. Now, in the post-colonial period of political freedom from colonial rule, African countries did not focus, like Asia did, on achieving strategic economic transformation. They made this strategic error for two reasons. And mark you, remember that African countries in those years were mostly operating in the context of, state-led command economies. But they made two strategic errors. The first was to rely almost exclusively on natural resources for income. The second was to build a development model that was built around foreign aid, because the colonizers sold the idea to the African countries that as new countries, we have given you political freedom, but we can also help you to develop your countries through a number of aid programs. So, but aid and the dependency that it engendered became a very bad habit. It prevented African countries from developing efficient taxation systems, prevented them from investing in science and technology and innovation and the commercialization of the products of innovation, prevented them from investing in their health systems because those expenses had been subcontracted out to development aid agencies like USAID, and they were not funding, integrated health systems development, but they were funding special disease programs like HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And, so the elements that form the basis of real economic development were neglected. Africa became an official ward of the international community, quote unquote. The aid industrial complex developed, a complex of businesses, profits, and projects, all built around aiding Africa to develop. And the perfectly contradictory phrase, international development, became accepted as conventional wisdom and a staple of academic curricula of that title sprouted in Western world universities. I don't know if you have such a course here called international development, but if you do, I'd suggest you have a second thought about it. Yeah, for reasons I will explain in the lecture. So African agency was systematically destroyed. Even the headquarters of the African Union was built and donated to the continent's countries by a foreign power. Sure enough, the building was later discovered to be completely and massively bugged. And so the conversations at the African Union were being heard very far away in the benevolent great power that built the building. So now here comes Trump 2.0. And I think it's a supreme irony that the ray of hope for ending Africa's dependency on foreign aid should come in the form of a political earthquake of disruptive proportions through the election of Donald Johnson Trump to a second non-consecutive term in office as President of the United States. So there are many implications of Trump 2.0 and the rise of right-wing populism in the Western world, including in America, in France, in Germany, in Austria, in Hungary, and so on. But I think we are not able to understand this process if we do not understand something about international relations theory. And I belong to a school of thought called the English School Theory of International Relations. And those of you in the MIA program would have read or heard about Hedley Bull, the Australian professor at the University of Oxford and at the London School of Economics. And this school of thought looks at the world, contemporary modern world, in three epochs of order in international relations. The first is what they call the international system. The second is what they call the international society. The third is what they call the international community, the cosmopolitan world society. If you look at history from the Treaty of Westphalia, which established territorial sovereignty as the anchor of international relations and the modern state system, you will see that what is called the international system reigned for many years, about 3 or 4 centuries. The way countries related to each other in the international system was on the basis of the traditional processes of commerce, trade. They would send envoys to one another, and occasionally there would be wars. Beyond that, every country minded its own business, essentially. But from the time of the establishment of the Universal Postal Union in the late 1800s, which really brought globalization, because people could now post a letter and it would get to another country in a relatively short time, and so on, countries began to come closer. International organizations were now formed, and countries could cooperate in those international organizations while at the same time competing for influence and dominance in what in international relations theory is called anarchy, a controlled struggle for ascendancy. And then you now have the third epoch, which is the cosmopolitan world society, the international community, where we are now told that we are our brother's keepers. And this period came in with the end of the Cold War, and America became a unipolar power, and we're told that we're all our brother's keepers. Sovereignty should be put down. What happens in your country is not just the business of the government, it's the business of the whole world, and so on. Nevertheless, this international community was fraught with double standards. They sat by and watched as genocide in Rwanda took the lives of 800,000 people in 3 months, and there was no intervention. We've seen the wars in Sudan and so on. So what is called the international community in reality is the international society, the good old international society, but the name was changed. And the whole purpose, I submit, was to enable some members of the international community to have others for lunch. And that's what's been going on. So Trump 2.0 is a product of these forces and the intersection of these forces with domestic politics, because many people in developed countries began to say, wait a minute, we elected our government. We don't have to be told by the UN how to run our lives. We don't have to be told by the European Union how to run our lives. We are sovereign. And this movement began to rise in a lot of advanced countries. We don't owe people who don't pay taxes here development aid. And so Trump came bringing back the America First movement that has existed for decades in the United States. And so this is what brought Trump. And he, of course, he is dedicated to bringing down the globalist international order that has previously challenged sovereignty, sovereign legitimacy, and homegrown challenges to solving problems. And he has restored the primacy and some would say the legitimacy of populist domestic politics in international relations. We know he has slashed commitments to Europe. Europeans are now being forced to become more military because they now can see that Uncle Sam is not, looking out for them anymore, which was the whole basis of the transatlantic relationship. That's ended. And of course, with Africa, there was even, less connection, only through development aid and some other military assistance and those kinds of things. And of course, we know that the main reason for this tectonic shift was to appeal to his political base in the United States. All politics is local, as they say. So not always global, as we have been led to believe. And with Trump, we can see it. His base is happy. His political opponents are very unhappy. I belong to a WhatsApp group of some very, very high-ranking Americans, and somebody shared a message just commiserating with colleagues. Have you had a heart attack yet? If you haven't, stay strong. That sort of thing. So the liberal left in America is really in a tizzy. But what's the impact on Africa? Trump has basically disbanded USAID, which was the main instrument of US involvement with Africa. Established in 1961, the United States Agency for International Development has spent billions in developing countries, but even more in Africa, funding all sorts of programs that were supposed to be for development aid or humanitarian assistance, and some people would say funding some other things that were not so nice as well. And this has hit Africa like a ton of bricks, because many African countries, because they built their development thinking on the basis of aid dependency, could never have imagined the world without USAID. And having subcontracted their responsibility to provide health care to their citizens, the programs of the USAID that have been cut have real impact in the continent. Lives are being taken, jobs are being destroyed, because of this Trump policy. The USAID allocated $12 billion to African countries in 2023, mostly food security, food assistance and security programs, and healthcare as well. Now, the impact, as I was saying, of the Trump aid cuts is and will be devastating. There's a projection that about 6 million more Africans will go into extreme poverty in 2026 as a result of the agglomerated impacts of this policy decision. But I argue, despite the seemingly catastrophic impact of the US aid cuts, I argue that Africa lost far more than it ever gained from development aid. Far, far more. And that our continent should take this international political earthquake as an opportunity to create a paradigm shift that will lead to a real development, or to real development in the continent. Francesco talked a lot about, impressive economic growth numbers. The problem Africa has had is not a problem of growth. It's a problem of the quality of growth. Someone, I think it was Edward Abbey, once said, growth for its own sake is the ideology of the cancer cell. So a lot of growth has been taking place in the continent, but a lot of economic development has not taken place, much less economic transformation. So you have development, which is basic healthcare, water, schools, education systems. Then you have structural transformation away from dependence on natural resources into more value-added and sophisticated products exported and earning a lot of money, which is the model that Asia has undertaken. So this was always the problem with the growth of Africa. Now, so, the emotional appeal of the short-term impact of the reduction on foreign aid, in my view, should not becloud rational thinking about the opportunity that Africa has from the decisions that Donald Trump has taken. There are many reasons why I argue that aid was never in Africa's interest. First of all, like I said, the phrase international development is an oxymoron. Development can never be transplanted from foreign countries to any soil. Development is a local process. And it takes time, and it begins in the mind. And it begins in a worldview, a mindset anchored by a set of values that affect how people organize themselves in their own societies and achieve progress and better lives over time. That's what development is. So when you say international development, it's like I said, it's just clearly an oxymoron. And many African countries have lacked this national ambition, a world view. Who are you in the world? Where are you coming from? Where are you going? How do you intend to get there? What's your strategy and what's the value system on which your national strategic global ambition is anchored? These things have been absent in too many African countries for too long and have been replaced by, people saying, the kindness of strangers, basically, or what I called in my book, Emerging Africa, the cartel of good intentions, you know. So this is what has been going on. Secondly, aid is not essential, but African countries were made to believe that it is. They were made to believe so because it looked like it was free. If somebody's giving you a grant, you have to be very self-aware to say, what's behind this? Is this really in my interest in the long term that I'm taking, because nothing is free, not even in Freetown, you know? So aid is not essential, even though it was made to look as if it was. And the price of aid has been huge for Africa. The most important is the loss of self-respect between donor countries and recipient countries. So if you're receiving organized handouts, you really cannot say that you're an independent country in reality. And I now recall here the notable essay by Kishore Mahbubani, the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He wrote an essay in 1998 in which he asked the provocative question, can Asians think? At that time, that was a really, really powerful provocation. I mean, what does he mean? This is so insulting. Da, 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 da. What does it mean? Of course we can think. You know, and he said he knows this is sensitive, but he's Asian and he's entitled to ask the question for his own reasons and the subjects he was looking at. As an African, I feel entitled to ask when I look at the foreign aid scenario, can Africans think? If so, what have they been thinking? Relying on this model all this while. So the third reason is that aid is not the kindness of strangers. Foreign aid is a tool of domination. It's a tool for the projection of worldviews. It creates, it promotes geopolitical and strategic interests of the donors. And often that's at the expense of the recipients. Number four, foreign aid has not worked in reality, even though it was presumed that it would bring development, but the real economic development and the structural transformation of the African continent has not taken place. So in terms of actual evidence that aid brings development, there isn't really any. Fifth, foreign aid has spawned vast amounts of corruption in African countries, largely because it creates perverse incentives, you see? And the amount of corruption that takes place in some of these countries, even outside of the aid sector, makes it very clear that this aid was never necessary in the first place, you know? So this is another reason. And of course, we know that the performance accountability of most foreign aid projects is next to zero. The only country I know in Africa which, even in the context of development aid, was actually performing and making use of those things to actually advance the interests of their citizens is Rwanda. I don't know of any other country that was able to make use of aid in a way that it could even be argued to have been useful. And yet, President Paul Kagame has supported Trump's decision. And when the reporter, I was watching it on CNN, asked him, but your country is benefiting from aid, he just smiled and said, maybe we need to learn some lessons. So here is a thinking, African, obviously. So So these are some of the reasons why I believe that the path to Africa's development cannot run through development aid, but must run away from aid. So aid abstinence is a huge opportunity for Africa and is exactly what Africa needs to make progress. So, a baby will not eat solid food if at some point it's not, breastfeeding is not stopped. So this is the same analogy that you see here. There are other implications of Trump 2.0 for Africa's development. One of them, and perhaps the most important, is about this matter of democracy. Now, when America became the king of the world in the unipolar world after the end of communism, what they were telling African countries as a condition to give them aid is that you must transmute from being a military democracy to becoming a democracy. And so many military dictators just changed their uniform, put on some civilian clothes, and ran for elections and won. And so you have that whole thing about democracy. Democracy is the path to development. But if we look at Africa today, in reality, you will find that many voices are questioning whether Western style liberal democracy has actually worked for Africa as a path to development, with very few exceptions in Africa, such as Botswana, Ghana, Senegal, Mauritius, Kenya, and South Africa. Western style liberal democracy has not thrived in the continent, let alone brought development. So there are two questions. Is what is happening in many of these countries actually democracy? And the second level is it actually leading to development? So, in many cases, what you really need for a democracy, educated electorates, independent institutions, unbiased umpires do not exist. So what you actually have are anocracies, and in some instances, plutocracies, being all called democracy. And so now with what is happening in America in Trump 2.0, the very tenets of democracy that America and the world has known are currently being challenged by populism. Many people are questioning what is going on in the United States. The judiciary is being attacked, their decisions are no longer respected, and so many other things are going on that do not look like what we have come to understand democracy to be. And so the question then becomes, if the United States, which was selling democracy to Africa, is now in a challenged relationship with the very idea itself, what is Africa to make of this as the continent looks for its path to development? And I argue that Africa needs homegrown models and thinking about development, both political and economic. In the political sphere, my argument is this: if you want to be a Western style democracy, by all means pursue that, but do it well. Do it well. Educate your citizens so that they can actually vote. Educate, have strong institutions. Let there be unbiased umpires so that when you count the results, it's actually the results, not like Stalin, who would say it's not the votes that matter, but the people who count the votes. So when that is the case, then something is going on. Like Francesco alluded, I once ran for office in my country, and I could give another lecture about that, but we don't have time. But it will not be out of order as well for us to look at or adapt democracy to homegrown models of political organization in Africa. After all, even Western liberal democracy takes different forms in different countries. There is no uniform democracy. In America, you have the Electoral College, which some people will say, how can somebody win the popular vote and lose the election? What is democracy defined? This is not democratic. Some people have that view, but they've done it because there was a reason that came from their own circumstances why they created the Electoral College model as part of the presidential election. In Switzerland, has the purest form of democracy, but they have a rotational presidency because they recognize that they're a multi-ethnic country and they want to maintain balance and inclusivity and a sense of belonging. So, Africa has the right to invent or adapt or organize how it should be governed. African countries, and that's country by country. It doesn't have to be the same across Africa. Like Francesco said, Africa is not a country. It's a continent of 54 countries. So I think it's important that we look at this. And there's so many other implications of Trump 2.0, one of which is, what will China now do? What will the relationship between Africa and China be? Will they take up the slack that America is leaving behind? My advice to African countries, don't even think about it, because all great powers are in the same business. They are in the business of advancing their natural interests. So stop behaving like an abused spouse, saying, okay, this person said hi, maybe he or she loves me. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that. You have to interrogate things, So what are some, and another implication, of course, is that the very international organizations, including internationally, global economic governance, which has really framed the economic development discourse in the world, has been affected by this isolationist tendency. You see America now pulling out of some of the international organizations, questioning the WTO's governance of trade, and so on and so forth. So these organizations are being weakened. What does that mean for Africa? For too long, Africa has looked up to these organizations to guide its economic thinking and its economic planning without interrogating for itself what is best for it or what will work for it. Because we were not present at the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions after the Second World War. Only Liberia was independent, and Ethiopia, I think. All the other countries were colonies at the time. So we were joiners, but not, creators. And that has implications, because these organizations were framed in a manner that favored the advanced industrialized countries, but did not favor African countries. What are some of the lessons that we can learn from Asia? Can Africa be the next Asia? I would say that Asia offers several lessons for Africa. Some of those lessons can be replicated, others are not transplantable. Asia is Asia, Africa is Africa. But we have some things in common. One of those things we have in common is the colonial experience. And from what I have seen, one of the lessons that Africa can learn from Asia is the lesson of possibilities. What is possible? Asia is a powerful example, Asian countries. Let's look at Singapore. This country moved from a GDP per capita of $1,000 to a GDP per capita of $25,000 within a generation. And that has even doubled, if I'm correct, since then. So this is a powerful example. And one of the things it says is that Asia did not allow its colonial experience to become an excuse. Asia's colonial experience became a core component of its worldview, because Asia developed a chip on the shoulder and they wanted to rival their former masters. And so they've been able to create wealth and development at very, very huge levels. Of course, another lesson, another influence in Asia was Japan after Second World War. The rise of Japan was a big motivator for many Asian countries. So the question is, which country in Africa will rise like Japan? And everybody will look at it and it's close enough to say, wow, we want to be like our neighbor. Will it be Nigeria? Will it be South Africa? Will it be Rwanda? Will it be Ghana? We don't know. And we want to see how this will unfold. But one of the lessons of possibilities is it suggests something, and that is that the mindset factor, the worldview, is actually what drives the development process in every society. And we see that every worldview is anchored on a value system. In Asia, it's Confucianism. We know that the influence of Confucianism in this area, in this part of the world, was similar to that of the Protestant work ethic in the Western world about 3 centuries ago. So Asia also has little or no natural resources, yet it has risen rapidly. Africa has a large chunk of the world's natural resources, but has not yet been able to achieve economic transformation. The question is why? The lesson is that Asia invested massively in education and skills for its young people. And those kinds of investments have not yet been made in Africa. And this, in particular, was the secret behind the rise of China. China invested for decades in education, even before they changed from communism to state capitalism. So this is a very important lesson that I think Africa needs to learn. Closely related to this is, of course, the matter of population. Asia managed its population growth downwards. Africa needs to learn that lesson. Today, everybody's saying African countries will double their population by mid-century, and this automatically means that Africa will be, quote unquote, the next big thing. Beware of conventional wisdoms. Beware of fads. There was a time it was said Africa is rising, it's going to take over the world. But yeah, even though some progress was made, that is not what necessarily has happened. So I am not persuaded by this. And I believe African countries need to manage their population growth so that their economic growth can overtake their population growth. In many countries, it's the reverse. And once that is happening, what you're building up is a youth bulge for the future, not some huge prosperous continent. So this is my position, and I would argue it quite strongly. Now, we should also know that in relation to the topic we are discussing today, Asia has not transformed based on any reliance on foreign aid. Asia has transformed based on proper, sound economic thinking, strong leadership by the likes of Lee Kuan Yew, who had vision and had competence and organized their societies effectively, even when the West was lambasting him and criticizing him and calling him a dictator. He knew where he was going and he stuck to it, him and his colleagues. Let us conclude. A decade ago, in a book I wrote called Emerging Africa, How the Global Economy's Last Frontier Can Prosper and Matter, I argued that foreign aid was already in decline, had no sustainable future, and that African countries ought to win themselves off development aid dependency. And they should have a 10-year sunset clause. I made this argument in 2014. That African countries should say, we can receive aid for the next 10 years, but we must plan a transition out of aid, and we have a plan that in 10 years, we will no longer be receiving aid. If anybody heard me and made any decisions based on this argument, it must have been invisible and the greatest example of silent transformation. So, which means nobody heard what I was saying. So today, as Africa ponders its development trajectory in a Trumpian new world order, forced to begin a search for self-reliance by Trump-imposed aid drought, the continent must look inward much more than it does outward. Africa can only compete outwardly by reorganizing inwardly. Development is first and foremost about identity. And Africa's identities, cultures, worldviews, and narratives must all be awakened and adapted to modernity where necessary. Massive investments in education and skills for Africa's youth, figuring out how to improve access to finance, and investing heavily in science, technology, and innovation, where Africa has a very clear advantage. Some of the things we've done in the area of finance and, financial payment systems and so on and so forth, very, very innovative stuff. And this can become a lot more part of public policy, part of statecraft, and it can really lead to the rise of the continent. Now, developing competent government and effective public policy in Africa requires a focus on education, governance education to be specific. And this is the purpose of the African School of Governance, which I and my colleagues are here this evening representing. We have signed an MOU with the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Our institution was established to train the current and future leaders of Africa with a mindset. Remember that word again, the mindset, the knowledge, the skills to enable Africa confront the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. And this is why, as I often say, the African School of Governance intends to be for Africa what the Lee Kuan Yew School has been for Asia. And this is why our visionary co-founders, His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of Rwanda, His Excellency Haile Mariam Desalegn, former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, this is why they chose the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for a founding strategic partnership. The exemplary impact of Lee Kuan Yew, who took Singapore, in his own words, in his much read book, quote, from third world to first, has been a major inspiration. So to conclude, what does Donald Trump mean for Africa? I was always irritated when those questions were being asked. Oh, what does Trump mean for Africa? There are two answers. First of all, first of all, we can say nothing. It means nothing for Africa. Nothing. Africa is nobody's real estate. And I use the word real estate, in a stylish way, except that of Africans. And the continent should take care of itself. The second answer is everything. That Trump means everything. Why? Because Donald Trump may have paradoxically set Africa free to think for itself for the first time in a long time and to organize itself for real development. And so, painful as it is and will be for a while, it might be appropriate to say, without doubt, with some controversy, thank you, Mr. Trump.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really inspiring, a lot of very interesting points. You remind me maybe almost 20 years ago when I was in New York looking at some of the overhead in aid development. Those 12 billions, that you just talk about, how much actually was actually spent in Africa. Let's talk about efficiency separately, but how much of that money was actually spent in Africa, rather than in, flying people in and out and
Western consultants.
Precisely, exactly. So I remember we were looking at a UNDP, which at that time has 112% overhead. So thank you for all that. Please start to think about your own questions. I'll come to you. Maybe I just trigger one. You have inspired me to kind of think of this moment for Africa a little bit of maybe a moment that we've seen like a few weeks ago in Europe. If Africa was heavily dependent on aid, certainly Europe, for historic reasons, was heavily dependent on defense. And somehow a month ago, there's been this kind of revelation moment where you say, "Oops, maybe we cannot count on that, right, any longer." I wish Europeans had the same clarity of mind that you had when it comes to aid. But to stick with that parallel, Europe had in these decades an advantage, I think, which has created a relatively strong regional organization that has enhanced, with all the limits, and we can discuss that to great extent, but certainly has enhanced the level of cooperation and also overcoming history. I was wondering, what is your take on regionalism in Africa? There are obviously many regional organizations, subcontinental regional organizations, with limited effect in certain parts and others stronger. Do you see that as one possible vehicle? Because obviously cooperation is one of the things that has to happen here. And I think you guard us very much into cooperating with great powers, right? And how that can be difficult. Do you see a strong future in enhancing that kind of regional cooperation that as a vehicle for all the things that you have said?
Well, thank you, Francesco. I do see a very strong future for regional cooperation in Africa. And the African School of Governance has, as part of our architecture, a center for trade and regional integration. It's one of our 4 research centers. We have a center for homegrown innovations in governance across Africa. We have a center for African history and leadership. We have a center for trade and regional integration, and we have a center for technology and development, also technology and governance. So a lot of the ideas I put out in this lecture, the architecture, the thinking of the African School of Governance has tried to take care of these issues as we go forward in our work. So regionalism is important, one, because of trade. The truth is that one of the mistakes Africa made, strategic errors, was to rely on this so-called international or global trade and to listen to some of the liberal economic advisors who told them to liberalize everything, whereas the only things they were exporting were raw materials to the global north and importing finished goods from the global north. Now, that is a recipe for poverty. They're trying to correct it now with the African Continental Free Trade Area. And one of the reasons why that AFTA is so important is because if you look at the architecture of world trade, you will see that it's actually built on regionalism, regional trade. 70% of Asia's trade, of Europe's trade, is in Europe. 60% of Asia's trade is in Asia. 40% of North America's trade is in North America, but only 13% of Africa's trade is within Africa. That means that most of its trade is outside the region. Now they're seeing that that has been a disadvantage to them. So the African Continental Free Trade Area has been brought in to drop all these tariffs among our countries. And even then, the AFTA has been built on the building block of regional economic communities, the East African Cooperation, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, the SADC, the South, so regionalism is rising. The question is that there's a question they have to answer. Do you want political integration rather than just economic integration? But Europe was actually, first of all, a political project masquerading as an economic project. But in Africa, we have many different kinds of countries with many different currencies. Do you want a currency union and all those? These are questions to be answered. But certainly in terms of trade, dropping tariffs and just maximizing trade and payment systems across borders, Africa has much to benefit. And the African Export-Import Trade Bank has set up a system called the Pan-African Payment Settlement System, PAPS, whereby people can now trade across the country in their local currency and they absorb the cost. They have a system. So there's a lot of movement in this direction of regionalism. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Sir, please. Quickly introduce yourself.
Yes, certainly. Very good evening. My name is Shabir Hassanbai, and I was the former High Commissioner to Nigeria for 9 years. 2, 3 points, if I may, Chairperson. The first one is regarding skills training. I think during my time in Nigeria, most of the issues were on unemployment. And the first thing when I presented my credentials way back in 2008, the President of Nigeria requested what can Singapore do to improve the skills of Nigerians in whatever activity they would be embarking on. And I think it took me some time, but finally we persuaded our Institute of Technical Education to set up a training school in Abuja. So that was the first skills center outside Singapore that was started in Abuja. So coming to your point about skills, this is the most critical part, not only for Nigeria, but I think for the whole of African continent. People don't have basic skills, and unemployment rate is high. And so you have all kinds of other social and economic issues that crop up every now and then. So my first point that I want to just state is that skills. Uh, and the other thing is about aid. One day I went to see WHO in Abuja, and I wanted to find out from the World Health, I mean, not WHO, the World Bank, I beg your pardon. I went to see the World Bank head in Abuja and asked him what can we in the World Bank and Singapore do in terms of development in Nigeria. And to my surprise, he said, in fact, we can learn more from Singapore than what we can at World Bank can do for Africa. I told him, how is that so? He says, we only prescribe and give medicine. And if you don't like the medicine, you don't take. So the Africans don't like what they are told. At least in Singapore, you tell them very nicely. You have no agenda, and they understand how you went, as you correctly pointed out what late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said, from third world to first. And that's what we want to learn. How did you do it? So to join that particular observation, sorry, I just take 1 or 2 more minutes of your time. I was always asked to speak in Nigeria especially in Lagos, about what is the success story of Singapore's development. And I would always produce two pictures. A picture of Singapore in the backwaters in 1950s. Still, we were carrying water out from the well, chickens running around around our houses, and then fast forward to the modern Singapore. So one very perceptive civil servant asked me, High Commissioner, what is it? Why is it you keep two pictures separately, and what is the missing part in the center? And I said, that's what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew always stressed, is good governance. Africa lacks governance, Professor. And I think if your center can persuade people to perk up and provide the kind of leadership that the investors would like to believe in, that there are clear policies out there. And I think that one of the success stories of Rwanda is that very clear. They learned a lot of this from our success story in Singapore. And I think this is something we, African Center for Governance, could do. So that a couple of my things that came up to me during my 9 years. But one last point, the Center for African Studies was established in 2014 in Singapore by me. It took me 6 years to convince the people out here in Singapore that you need a center to create African awareness. It took me 6 years. I came to Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and they turned it down. I'm very happy now. Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy signed an MOU with you. I understand you are going to see the center director, Mr. Amit Jain, in a day or two.
Yeah.
I hope you will do a similar MOU with us. And I think the focus is quite different. We try to help Singapore companies, investors, to understand Africa before they just jump into Africa.
That's right.
So we will help them do the research, the marketing, because LKY School of Public Policy is a different think tank. But we wanted to join them, but we were refused. So I think we are ahead of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I'm very proud to say that in terms of creating awareness for Africa. And I'm very grateful to the African ambassadors here, resident ambassadors, who honored me in one African day of my work that I have done to bring Singapore and Africa together. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
React to any of this? Can I take a couple more questions, maybe? Please.
I used to study. Hello, can you hear me? Oh, hi. My name is Zhen. I used to study here, and now I'm running my tech company. We have a few projects with Mali and Namibia, so I'm very interested in the topics. Thank you very much for the very inspiring talk. I have 3 questions. The first one is regarding the U.S. and Africa in general relationship. So the last administration, Biden, they promote infrastructure project called the Lobito Corridor, which is a giant project connect Zambia, DRC, then to Angola. I think Biden's last foreign visit was to Angola. But now Trump, we don't know what's going to happen. So infrastructure project like this, requires a lot of international collaboration. So if thinking of the circumstances we're facing, is that project still like this still happening? What kind of alternatives that Africa can potentially look for? Because infrastructure is very critical in terms of economic development. The second question is uh, countries like Nigeria and Rwanda has a very good foundation, and with people taking back control, we believe there's a very positive trajectory. But however, I personally been to Mali, been to Guinea. Uh, they are one of the poorest countries, and without the foreign aid or without the foreign like support or investments, it's very difficult for them to rise from where they are now. So, what will be the strategy for country like them to to develop? Maybe you can share your vision. The third question is very interested in the school you are establishing. So someone like me, if we are interested, how can we contribute and participate? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other? Please take one more. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you, Prof. My name is Chen. I'm from China. I used to work in Africa for several years. So your lovely speech brought me back to my lovely days there. I have actually two questions. One is about the regionalization. When I work in Africa, I look forward to the assignment, the signing of the AFTA. But
So
at
can
that
you
time, it was
speak a little louder? Sorry,
oh,
hard time to.
the African continent free trade agreement. Now it has come true, but when I was there, I studied SADC and the SACU. It seems that the regional agreement is benefiting the big economies more than it is benefiting, small economies, less industrialized one. Are you concerned that these often may be benefiting big economies like South Africa more and make the continent regional ones more not that equally benefited? The second one is about the China. We have a lot of investment there in Africa. For the last 30 years, every prime minister of China, their first overseas visit is always in Africa. And we have a lot of aid programs. I like your idea that the Africans must rely on themselves to develop the continent. But truth is that we are doing a lot of that. I run some aid projects, infrastructure, donation of equipment, but most importantly, the capacity programs, capacity building program. We invite officials from governments across Africa to receive some seminar training programs, and we also send our experts to Africa. So I agree generally with you that aid is not the best way to develop the continent, but I think there will still a lot of potential between Africa and China in capacity building. Thank you.
Great. So I want to give you the floor, but we have 10 more minutes, so there's a lot on
Yeah,
the plate.
absolutely.
Please.
Yeah. Um, Thank you all. First of all, let me thank the ambassador, the former High Commissioner of Singapore to Nigeria, for your very, very strong and accurate insights, and for the work you've done in setting up the Center for African Studies here. Really, really appreciate that. US Africa Lobito Corridor, is it still on? The answer is blowing in the wind. Um, it's a big project, and I believe that there will always be pressure from the countries that will benefit from it for it to continue. That's my own belief. It's not so much an aid project as such, it's more of a real infrastructure project. Now, there's something we've seen about the current US administration, and Africans will be well advised to take advantage of that. The Lobito Corridor project is a very strategic project. Um, but some of these countries that it goes through, like Angola and some others, they have strategic natural resources. We know that the current leadership of the United States is very interested in strategic natural resources. I am not against win-win propositions. That's life. So African countries can structure deals with the United States that favors them in a way that enables them to transform their economies. And there's nothing wrong if the United States derives some benefit from that deal as well. I think that's a much better approach than aid. So I would recommend that African countries continue to put pressure to make sure that the Lobito Corridor project is completed. And if there are any sweeteners that might be added, one of the things we see in the world, the world is coming up with a lot of new things. I never knew that strategic natural minerals and resources, instead of causing conflicts, can actually help to resolve them. I'm just learning that. When people say part of the price of our ending this war is that we have to get this, it's not such a bad deal. You just negotiate it. So I hope the corridor continues. You talked about how Guinea and Mali that are independent, is there a strategy for them? Of course, there is always a strategy for any country that has strategic global intent and builds or develops the capacity. And it's all in the governance and in the leadership, like the ambassador says. Governance is the missing ingredient in many African countries. And that is why the African School of Governance was established. And that's a very powerful vision, because in another 10 years, in another 15, 20 years, if we do our work well, as we intend to, you will hopefully see a very big difference in the continent, because the school would have produced people who are thinking differently, leading differently, and achieving different kinds of results. So investment in governance is very important for countries like this. I mean, Switzerland and many small countries in Europe, what do they have? They don't even have any natural resources, and yet they're wealthy. So if Guinea and Mali were to mass produce inventions in their country by their people, invest heavily in education and skills, and find a way to attract finance and improve access to finance, they can transform their countries. There is no country that cannot develop. It's all about the mindset, and it's all about the governance capacity in place. So there's no country that can't make it or is hopeless, or no, I don't agree with that. Yeah. So the African continental, and you said you're interested in the ASG. That is really very good to hear. Go to our website, asg.ac. Yeah, www.asg.ac, and get more information about the African School of Governance. If you want to attend and take our MPA, you'll be very welcome to apply. And if there are other ways you want to be involved in, we welcome that interest, because you're interested in Africa. You don't have to be, from the continent, but we welcome people who are interested from other places. The AFTA, it seems to be benefiting big economies more. This seems to be true. But that's one of the things that, economics has this thing. There's always the pool of big economies. And, while we want to make sure that small economies are not excluded, perhaps big economies will probably have to benefit first before you can actually see the thing spread across the continent. So it's not unnatural that the big economies that have a gravitational pull are benefiting or appear to be benefiting more. The important thing about AFTA is to make sure that there's no discriminations against any country because it's small or it's a no. So once the playing field is equal, how people take advantage of it becomes a matter of national policy. So we would recommend to the small countries to become a lot more active You know, is there something you could produce and sell to the big countries that would benefit you? So it's all about strategy. See, so yeah, and you talked about the capacity building programs that you're running. That's very good and very laudable. That's all I can say. I can never question building and domesticating capacity because that's important. But it's not happening at scale the way it should be. The fact that China is doing it is not transforming the continent the way it should. It will be important for the governments of Africa to do it and lead it. They can work with China, but then you come to scale. Once this is taken to scale, you begin to see the impact in real lives and jobs. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Great. I think we've reached the end of the time allocated. I wanted to thank you very, very much for sharing your thought and for, putting Africa in our conversations as well. So I think that's very beneficial. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for joining tonight. Hope to see you soon again in the Lee Kuan Yew School.